Hello, welcome. We are delighted to get started. We are hosting a live event on Erich Neumann live from Zurich area, I guess I should say Switzerland, but outside of Zurich. Two broadcasters. Myself, I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, and let's go ahead and get started. The title for today is Erich Neumann, His Life and Work, and His Relationship with C.G. Jung. This is the first of, I believe, 5 seminars. This one we're opening up to everyone, and we hope that people continue for the full series if possible. We have 2 presenters. I apologize that the slide says Murray's name up there, but Murray Stein and John Hill are both going to be co-presenting today. So we have Murray Stein, John Hill. We'll introduce them in a second. My name is Steve Buser. I'll be hosting out of Asheville, North Carolina. Ryan Deegan may break in here or there. He's our technician, also stationed here in Asheville. Our seminar will be 90 to 120 minutes. It should be at least 90. We hope to have time for questions towards the end of it. When we do questions, you can email or not Skype, but I guess chat the questions to us. Hit the question button. Better yet, though, when we break for questions, if you can hit the raise your hand button on your control panel, that will allow us to open microphones and speak person to person. And we've noticed that's been just a delightful way to engage more fully with our community. Make sure your audio settings are correct, and your choices are microphone and speakers, which is the most common, or you can call in using the telephone. If you do that, you need to click on the button to set that up on the control panel and then call in. But most people do better with the standard computer speakers and microphone. Make sure to hit the full screen mode, and you can change the size of the video camera. So if you want one video larger than another, make sure to play around with clicking on the buttons or moving sliders, and you can choose which video is the larger on there. We are taping today, as we do for all our seminars, so if you don't want to be on the tape, make sure to not click raise your hand, because your voice will be taped. Or if you send in a question, just say you'd like it to be anonymous if you don't want us to reveal your identity at all. Our next Neumann seminar, number 2, will be including Nancy Swift-Ferlati, looking at Neumann and Jung as painters. That will be Thursday, February 23rd at the same time, 11 a.m. And you'll get more announcements about that as the time gets closer. But we're very excited to bring in Nancy as well with that. So Murray Stein, most of you, virtually all of you know Murray, and most of you know John Hill as well. Murray is a supervising training analyst, former president of the ISAP School, International School of Analytical Psychology in Zurich. He and Erich Neumann are the co-editors of one of the volumes, Turbulent Times, Creative Minds, about Neumann. Chiron Publications has produced 3 books looking at Erich Neumann. I believe those were in the links to the advertisements, but this one in particular is one that will be helpful to be looking at as we go through the seminar series. And Murray, of course, resides in Switzerland, just outside of Zurich. John Hill, most of you know as well. John has done many seminars with us here. Also, John is also a supervising training analyst at ISAP Zurich. Lectures widely, has written a marvelous book about some of the imagery of home and archetypal symbolism of the home, and has a particular interest in Erich Neumann as well, and will be, well, you'll see, but he'll be doing some letters with Neumann and Jung. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Murray, and he'll take it from here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. It's a great pleasure to that Asheville is sponsoring this series on Erich Neumann and Jung. And originally this was conceived to be a joint venture with my partner, Erich Neumann, who was going to be with me on all of these webinars in this series. Erich Neumann is very knowledgeable about Erich Neumann's life and work, and has been in close contact with the Neumann family, with Neumann's children, and was very largely responsible and active in producing the publication of the Jung Neumann letters in 2005. I'm sorry that he can't be with us on this series. He's struggling with illness, and we hope for his improvement. Maybe by the end of the series he'll be able to come back in and join us for some part of this. I sure hope so. So anyway, we miss Ariel. I understand he's watching us today, so hi Ariel. Gute Besserung, as we say in Switzerland. What we want to do in this first session of the series is to introduce you to the life and work of Erich Neumann and his relationship with Jung. And I want to start by just saying a few words about Neumann's place in analytical psychology. Neumann belongs to the top tier of first-generation Jungian analysts, maybe even the top of the top tier. Some people think of him as the primus inter pares, the first among equals. Of that group of people, very talented, very energetic authors and teachers who belonged to the Jungian circle during Jung's lifetime. And Erich Neumann was one of those, and one of the most important. When I first started reading Jungian works, this was in the late 1960s, around 1968, Neumann is one of the first authors I came across after Jung. And I discovered that there was a whole library that opened up when I went into this field, an astonishing number of brilliant works. And Neumann's was one of the first that I really exposed myself to, and I ate it like candy. I loved Neumann. I read The Origins and History of Consciousness shortly after beginning to read Jung himself. And I must say that I've never abandoned Neumann at all, but he was removed somewhat to the background in my training and in my later work, and I think that's true of the whole field, that Neumann's star in the Jungian firmament faded, and it's now coming back, and it's coming back strongly now. We speak of a Neumann Renaissance, actually, coming back largely because of the publication of the letters, the correspondence between Jung and Neumann that took place in 2005. And in response to that publication, a conference was held in Israel in April 2005 to acknowledge Neumann and to launch the correspondence, the letters between Jung and Neumann. And it was a wonderful conference, many speakers, very rich papers and interaction among people and discussion. And those papers have recently been published in a volume that Ariel Shalit and I worked on together. It's called Turbulent Times, Creative Minds. And the papers contained in this volume are largely the papers that were given at that conference. A few of the papers in the volume are added after the conference, and all of them were somewhat revised and edited for the book. And this book was published this year by Chiron Publications. And I think it's a wonderful introduction to Neumann's work, his thought. The main themes in his thought are all represented in these essays. And so for somebody who wants to get a good overview of who Neumann was, what he did, and his relationship to analytical psychology and specifically to Jung, would find a lot in this volume, at least to begin the study of Neumann's work. Neumann's contributions to analytical psychology are not only important, but quite numerous. They're big books, and they're very, very deep and thoughtful and rigorously thought through books. Neumann is sometimes considered the thinker in the Jungian world, at least in that generation. He is a systematic thinker. He's a theoretical thinker. He's a developmental thinker. He loves to think in stages of development. He's a very orderly and consistent and consequent thinker. And so it's a pleasure to read him, if you're a thinking type, at least. Somewhat dense sometimes, his work. His published work falls into the last 15 years of his life. He was born in 1905 and sadly died at an early age of 55 in 1960, just 6 or 7 months before Jung died. His life could be divided into two parts, pre-Jung and post-Jung, or pre-Jung and Jung, because he met Jung right at the middle of his life. He lived to the age of 55, and he met Jung when he was 27, 28. You can get a lot of information about Neumann's life from a number of works. The collection of letters is introduced by Martin Liebscher, the editor, and that introduction will give you a lot of background information about Neumann, where he comes from, what his interests were before he met Jung. Neumann was Jewish, German, originally born in Berlin, grew up in Berlin, went to German universities. Two of them, one he got a doctorate degree in philosophy, and he wrote a dissertation on a man named Kane, a 19th century romantic, mystical, theological, philosophical thinker. Neumann read deeply in Hasidic materials. He was a student of Martin Buber's, and he took a great interest in Kabbalah and Hasidic thought, writing, stories. And so with that background, he then entered into his psychological phase, taking an interest in psychoanalysis and then discovering Jung. And a good friend of his was Gerhard Adler. Gerhard Adler and Neumann were friends in Berlin, and they attended a seminar that Jung gave in 1933 in Berlin. You know that Hitler came into power in January of 1933. And the Jews of Germany were put on notice very quickly that their lives were not secure anymore. And for families like Erich Neumann's, who had been living in Germany for generations and whose family members were steeped in German culture and literature and philosophy, who identified very strongly with patriotic feelings of Germany during the First World War, were totally shocked by what was developing in Germany in 1933. And Erich Neumann and his wife Julie had been very interested in the Zionist movement even before Hitler came into power. And they decided to immigrate to Palestine. And when Neumann met Jung at the Berlin seminar, he was very taken with Jung. And he decided that this was going to be something he wanted to pursue, to work with Jung, to see if he could become a Jungian analyst and take that path as opposed to the Freudian path that was so prevalent and well known in Berlin already in the 1920s with the Psychoanalytic Institute there. And so on his way to Palestine, he and his wife Julie and their son Micha, who was 2 years old or so, went first to Zurich, and they spent about 8 months in Zurich, from the fall of 1933 until May or so of 1934. And Neumann was in analysis with Jung during that time, and with Tony Wolff, both. He had two analysts. And he and Jung then forged a very, very strong, turned out to be a very secure, long-lasting relationship in which Neumann accepted Jung as his teacher, as his mentor. And Jung saw very quickly, I'm sure it was very obvious once you met the man, Neumann, what a talented young man Neumann was. Neumann was 28 years old. Jung was 30 years old or 58 years old in 1933. And so they, you can't say they hit it off, as you'll see when we hear the letters that John Hill is going to read for us later. It was a very complicated relationship, very complex. But at the bottom of it, there was great mutual respect on the part of both men for the other. And I don't think that ever wavered one iota on Jung's part or on Neumann's part, even though their personal relationship had some very difficult moments. And one of the issues, of course, in the 1930s was the issue of the Jews in Europe, and Jung's position regarding the Jews in Europe and what was going on in Germany. And this, again, is a very complex issue. It's touched on by many of the papers in the book, Turbulent Times. It was a big topic at the conference. And Neumann addressed this issue directly and without pulling any punches, without holding anything back, directed his very strong and confrontive questions to Jung. Where do you stand? Do you understand what's going on in Germany today? And Jung was, I think, very taken back at first by these questions and remarks. I think he didn't know quite what to think of what was going on in Germany. I think he had very mixed feelings. He was divided. And Neumann forced him to, not only Neumann, but others of his Jewish students, like James Kirsch also, forced him to really start looking at his feelings about Jews, about the Jewish tradition, about Jewish religion and history, something that Jung had not really taken on board before that. This very complex question has been addressed by many people in the Jungian world and outside of the Jungian world. And it was a big topic, a big theme in the relationship between Neumann and Jung. Neumann spent, as I said, 8 or 9 months in Zurich, and then he moved with his family to Tel Aviv, where he spent the rest of his life. And while he was in Tel Aviv, he began writing to Jung, and Jung responded, of course. And they had a correspondence lasting the remaining years of Neumann's life through right up until his death in 1960, his surprising and early death, surprising to him, surprising to everybody. And during his time in Israel, Neumann began to write, and his first writings were not published. Some of them are now being edited for publication, some have already been published. And the theme of his writings and his thinking at that time was Jewish history, the psychology of the Jews, the history of the psychology of the Jews from earliest times, biblical times until the present, what was going on in Palestine during his day, the Jewish mystical tradition, and all of these materials absorbed a great deal of his energy. He gave lectures and seminars on it. He wrote a large manuscript that Ann Lammers is now working on and will publish in a year or two. And she will join us in the third of this series to tell us about her work on these unpublished manuscripts. And then around 1940, Neumann left off with that work on the topic of Jewish history and Jewish background, and shifted to a more general psychology perspective, an archetypal perspective that would encompass not only a single human tribe, human group of people, the Hebrews, the Jews, but also all people of the West, and indeed generally a developmental process that takes place worldwide. And that's when he wrote The Origins and the History of Consciousness. It's more or less a description of the development of consciousness in the West, but it's also the development of consciousness in the individual, going through the stages of individuation, 3 stages that he talks about: the matriarchal, the patriarchal, and then finally the individual. He believed that ontology recapitulates philology, not philology, but that the individual's development repeats the development of the species. And this is an old theory embedded in biology. It's not much subscribed to today, but it's an interesting way of thinking about the development of cultures anyway. And then a second book that he wrote during those early years of the 1940s was a book on ethics, depth psychology, and the new ethic. And those 2 books were his first publications after 1945, when the war ended and the world returned to more or less a normal state, and he could start thinking about publishing his work. And both those books were submitted for publication in Zurich by the Psychological Club, which ended up not publishing them, but he found other publishers, and Jung helped him find support for his work. And then they were very quickly also translated into English and published in English. And that was then followed by a number of major works that came out of his association, largely his association with Eranos. And in our 5th webinar of this series, Riccardo Bernardini is going to speak about Neumann at Eranos. Neumann began attending the Eranos conferences in 1948 at the suggestion of Jung. And Jung put him in touch with Olga Frebi-Capitan, who was the organizer and founder of the Eranos conferences. And she invited Neumann, and he accepted to give his first talk in 1948 that was called Mystical Man, a magnificent essay. And he was so impressive that very quickly he became designated as Jung's heir apparent at Eranos. Jung had dominated the scene at Eranos since its beginning in 1933. And Neumann was now stepping in as the next generation And Olga Frebi-Kapitan, quotes, fell in love with him. I mean, she was very enamored of Neumann and his work. And she offered to let him write the introduction for a book that she was preparing on images that she had collected from various sites in the Middle East and the Mediterranean area of the Great Goddess. And she'd been making this collection for a number of years, and she had these pictures in her archive. She showed Neumann her archives. He was blown away. He was astonished at what she had collected. And she said, well, would you consider writing an introduction for this book? And he jumped on it. The thing is, he ended up writing the book himself. He took the pictures and he wrote The Great Mother, which is one of his best known works, probably the work for which he is the most famous outside the Jungian community, because everybody in mythology studies or religious studies, art history and so on, has been exposed to this book, and many, many people have read it. And it's a Jungian analysis of the cult of the Great Mother in the Mediterranean area. And it's a wonderful book. It's a theoretical book. It's a anthropological book. It's a historical book. And it's become a classic. And that was published in the early 1950s. And in the meantime, he was giving lectures at Eranos every year. And every one of them is a jewel. Every one of them is brilliant. Neumann rarely repeats himself. He's a meta-psychological thinker. He's a speculative thinker. And he elevates analytical psychology to a level of theory that nobody else has achieved, in my mind. There have been many great Jungian writers, but Neumann, as a theoretician, I think stands head and shoulders above everybody else. And these Eranos lectures, of which there were, I think, 12 or 13, every year from 1948 to 1960, he came to Eranos in the summer, in August, and gave one of these masterpieces. And they've been collected, translated into English in 3 volumes that look like this. This is called The Place of Creation. These are all published by Princeton University Press. These are collections of his essays. The Fear of the Feminine and Other Essays on Feminine Psychology, one of Neumann's great themes, feminine psychology. And our 4th webinar in this series will be devoted to Neumann's work on the feminine and feminine psychology. And that will be led by Rina Porat, an Israeli analyst who is a specialist in this subject, Neumann's work. And she will be accompanied, God willing, and we hope, by Dvora Kuczynski, who studied with Neumann. She's now 90 years old, 90 plus, studied with Neumann in the 1950s, and her story is astonishing in itself. She's a survivor of Auschwitz, and she made her way as a young woman to Palestine and started working with Neumann and became one of his top students, and really carried on his work in Israel after he passed away in 1960, and is the grande dame of Jungian psychology in Israel, as the teacher of many of the analysts who live there today. So these Eranos lectures are a gold mine for people who want to think further theoretically in analytical psychology. I think they're an unmined gold mine. I've been studying some of them quite intensively in the last year or two and writing about them, and they never cease to surprise me with their depth and their extension. Neumann had such a broad mind, really a wonderful metaphysical sort of mind, theoretical mind. So Neumann, just to round off his life and work, lived in Israel from 1934 until the end of his life in 1960. Lived in Tel Aviv in a house that looked out to the Mediterranean toward Europe. He found in Aranos a base in Europe that he could go to every year. He often met with Jung on his trips to Switzerland. And they forged, in the course of time, a personal relationship of great depth and mutual appreciation, if not mutual admiration. Neumann was very close to Emma Jung before her death in 1955. And of course, Tony Wolff was his analyst. Anila Yaffe was in the inner circle and very fond of Neumann and his work. And while Neumann had a lot of difficulty in Zurich, and this will come out in his letters that you will hear John Hill speak about and read in a moment, had a lot of difficulty with the inner circle in Zurich for any number of reasons. Maybe he was an outsider, they were insiders, maybe they were envious of him, of his brilliance, his mind. He was quite aggressive. He did not mince words. He wasn't nice all the time. At any rate, he had his difficulties with the Jungians in Zurich, but not really so much with Jung. And Jung sometimes felt divided between his loyalties to his own close friends and co-workers in Zurich and this man far away in Israel. But when push came to shove, he affirmed Neumann, he affirmed his work. And I think in his heart of hearts, he saw Neumann as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of his students and followers. And it was devastating to him and to the whole Jungian movement when Neumann died at such an early age. Now, I would like to introduce John Hill as Erich Neumann, if I may. At the conference in Tel Aviv in 2015, John played the role of Erich Neumann in a performance that we staged of the letters, in which I played the role of the narrator. Paul Brucci played the role of C.G. Jung. John Hill played the role of Erich Neumann, and Darian Pictet played a variety of roles of women figures who entered into the picture from time to time in the correspondence. And John has agreed to join us today as Erich Neumann and speak a bit about the letters and to read excerpts from the letters for us to give you a little bit of the feeling of Neumann's style and personality, the flavor of Neumann the man. So, John?
Hello, everyone. I'm honored to speak to you. I hope technically everything is working. And especially regards to Errol, who I believe is watching. Thank you, Murray, for that very interesting and deep presentation. Okay, so I have chosen 3 letters. The first letter, I would say, expresses Neumann's assertive realism. He warns Jung quite decidedly about the dangers of the Nazis. Secondly, he criticizes Jung's understanding and distinction between the Aryan and the Jewish unconscious. There's a second letter. Again, it expresses his anger with a letter he received from Tony Wolff. This letter concerns the huge controversy about the publication of his book, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. It expresses Neumann's warrior nature. He's ready to fight the whole institute when it comes to defending his new book, but it's not without a touch of humor. And finally, the third letter, written in 1957, outlines a vision that inspired the new ethic. This letter gives us some insight into Neumann's deep spirituality. So I start with the first letter, and as Murray has just explained, it was written in sometime, probably spring of 1934. Neumann had left Berlin and on his way to Israel, but he stopped over in Zurich and did analysis with Jung. There doesn't seem to be an answer to this letter, but probably discussed in the sessions. So it was written in 1934, and it concerns a public controversy set off by a letter written by a Dr. Bali to the NZZ, a very famous Zurich newspaper, in which Bali accuses Jung of anti-Semitism. Jung defends himself in another letter, but his remarks have upset many of his Jewish students, especially Erich Neumann. I start. Dear Dr. Jung, I spoke in some dismay with Miss Wolf today about the partial validity of Dr. Bali's article, and she gave me your paper, The State of Psychotherapy Today. I could not have imagined what a controversy of such fateful personal significance was about to unfold. As a Jew, I do not feel I have any license to intervene in a controversy that no German can avoid today when facing the Germanic unconscious. It's certainly correct that we Jews are accustomed to recognizing the shadow, but I cannot comprehend how someone like you fails to see what is all too cruelly obvious to everyone this day. A mind-numbing cloud of filth, rottenness, and blood brewing in the Germanic psyche. Where I come from, great men are expected to be called upon to exercise discernment and to stand against the crowd. Furthermore, is there not a trace of misunderstanding in your sentence? The Aryan unconscious has a higher potential than the Jewish one? The Jewish Renaissance, the Hasidism movement, as well as that of Zionism, demonstrates the liveliness of the Jewish people. The Jewish Renaissance, it seems to me, to be more youthful, embryonic, and full of energy than the rigid, stolid, brutally organized, and extreme submissiveness in the Aryan revivals of the Nazis. It seems to me this depends on the consciousness of the race, which changes throughout history. Expressly in the case of the Jewish people, it has changed repeatedly and will change again. I hope there's not too much Mars in this. That there is some Mars in it, I know. and I stand by it. Yours, Erich Neumann. So, the second letter came in April 1949. It's from Tel Aviv. So Erich Neumann was already settled in Israel, and of course it was after the war. Back in Zurich, his new book, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, had just been published. And it raised a huge controversy among Jung's disciples at the Jung Institute, especially C.A. Meyer, a well-known Jungian analyst at that time. He apparently walked out in the midst of Neumann's presentation in Eranos. Secondly, another enemy of Neumann was Yolanda Jacobi, who wrote a very divisive and vicious letter to Jung, claiming that Neumann was setting up a new scheme. He was too intellectual. He impressed none of the men, but all of the women. But Neumann, on hearing this, was not one to give up. And so he answers in this letter, April 1949. Dear Professor Jung, I've just received a letter from Miss Wolf today that I have fallen from grace. The court has turned against me. This troubles me little, but I'm astonished to hear from Miss Wolf that all of a sudden my point of view is no longer that of depth psychology. I am willing to defend my book, The New Ethic, against the whole institute, Protestants, Catholics, baptized Jews, unbaptized Jews, or even against any Jungian analysts, should any dare show up. Who would have thought of it? Who would have thought of it? May I quote you from Miss Wolf's letter? You no longer seem to be on good terms with nature, hence with the unconscious and the inner laws of nature. Your Old Testament perspective is getting in your way. This is why it must indeed be a text on ethics. End of quote. You see, it's come to this. Why, for God's sake, do you not recognize the danger that's facing you, us, and your work? I still dare to hope that if I'm roaring like a lion, shaking my mane, and not letting my coat be ruffled by holy or unholy dogs, I hope that you must understand this as a fellow lion. I fear that your institute, and Mrs. Jacobi in particular, will have to create an orthodoxy because nothing of their own occurs to them. I am not old Protestant, not Old Testament, but a Jew who's experienced in the deepest way possible that ritual and symbol cannot protect what is human if there is no moral I to constitute its counterpart, and if no old or new ethical stance forms a counterpart to the symbol-laden unconscious. This is where the justification lies for having written this book. A Mrs. Jacobi on her knees, that is the danger, and not an all too belligerent Erich Neumann. And now we move to the third letter, written in 1957. There were only 4 more letters written to Jung, and it was 3 years before his death in 1960. Tel Aviv, the 14th of June, 1957. Dear C.G. Jung, let's start with the main event. My book, The New Ethic, was an attempt to process a series of fantasies which roughly corresponded with the extermination of the Jews, in which the problem were being tossed around inside of me. At those images, at the end of which stands the following in brief. I seemed to be commissioned to kill the ape-man in a deep primal hole. As I approach him, I see him hanging by night on the cross, his single crooked eye staring into the depth. At first, it seems I was to blind him, when all of a sudden I recognized his innocence, his dependence on the single eye of the Godhead, which was experiencing the depth through him, which was a human eye. Then I sank down opposite the single eye and jumped into the hole, but was caught by God, who carried me on the wings of his heart. After that, the single eye closed opposite me, and it opened in my forehead. Working out from this event, I attempted to process it, and finally I arrived at my book, The New Ethic. For me, since then, the world looks very different. The formulations in your letter are also valid for me. I quote you, "As a man, I am a weakling and susceptible to being overcome by evil." Yes. That's superficially all too true, but it doesn't go far enough. I have subsequently had to do evil, and I didn't experience it as a sin, but as a necessary action. Again you write, "I will avoid evil when I can, but will fall into this hole all the same." As I see it, I do not fall, but jump into the hole. And I know the danger exists that I might die. But my prayer goes, may the wings of the heart hold me. This means that I am in my action within and not outside the Godhead, because this moral action is not an action of the ego, but about a happening which I must hand myself over to. This is not about, and again quoting you, putting a brave face on it, but about reverence before the numinosity of the Godhead, in which I am implicated with the knowledge that there is no justice and no judge, because the measure of God's eye surpasses all this. A moral action and human dignity is not about not exciting any bother, but in enduring the responsibility for one's in the certainty that behind all this there is one hidden who is superior to me and who guides me. To tear down the old gods is not a sin. It's the very reverse of sin. It means to place oneself at the disposal of new aspects of the Godhead. Yours, Erich Neumann. I'll just say that's the last letter that I am going to recite. If you want an explanation of that last vision on the ape man, read the appendix to Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. It outlines in a more intellectual way what that vision means. In one sentence, it's connecting the shadow, the earthy, the instinctual with the Godhead. It's breaking that division between those two realms. So, I think I have done my little bit, but I can still...
Thank you, John. I think you've done your bit very well. Despite the technology, it came across beautifully and very intensely delivered. I'd like to take, maybe just have a little discussion with you, and if some people in the audience would like to join us, that's fine too. You could open the microphones or take questions. But I'd like to take a point from each of these letters and just talk about it a little bit with you. The first one, where they talk about the potential of the unconscious. Jung wrote in that infamous essay, Psychotherapy Today, 1934, I think it was, that he said that the Jewish unconscious has less potential than the Aryan unconscious in a nutshell. And what he meant by that, and what he says also, is that in its long history, the Jews have integrated so much of the unconscious. They're now a much more conscious people than the Germanic peoples. The Germanic peoples came out of the woods fairly recently. They were converted to Christianity forcefully, not by some sort of spiritual insights, but on command from the authorities. And so the Germanic peoples have a relatively thin level of consciousness and a huge potential left in the unconscious, whereas the Jews have been making the unconscious conscious for 3,000 years now or longer, and so have integrated much more of the unconscious, and unlike what Jung usually says, that the unconscious is infinite, they've almost emptied the unconscious by now. So they're and what does that mean? I mean, it means on the one hand that the Germanic people have more energy, I suppose, more unconscious, more of a mythical uh, mentality. They're more religious still. The Jews have kind of emptied, have gone through that stage of the mythical mind and the religious mind. And he knew Freud, of course, knew Freud very well, and he saw a man there who was totally committed to the Enlightenment and to rationality, although privately he didn't seem to be that way, but certainly in his public persona. So he saw the Jews as a much more conscious, rational, ego-driven people than the kind of Germanic people stumbling out of the woods and still believing in mythical tales and religious states of mind and so on. I think that's what Jung tried to say. It's a very strange thing for Jung to say, and of course the timing was hideous, 1934. But Neumann counters that very strongly. Neumann understands exactly what Jung is trying to say. And he says, you don't know what's been going on among the Jews in these last few generations. All you see are a few of the Jews who have entered into the Enlightenment and accepted that program. But look at Hasidism, look at Zionism. There's a tremendous amount of stirring going on in the psyche of the Jewish people today. That's the way I read that. That's what I hear there, that he corrects Jung on his own ground, so to speak.
Yes, I completely agree. I mean, that article is unfortunate. As you say, it's the timing. To put, first of all, an article on psychotherapy, it's very good, it's very differentiated about psychotherapy, but why does he sort of have to compare the Jews to women, to say that they don't have their own culture, they've lived off other cultures, and then take a whack at Freud? I mean, that sort of whole one thing after the other just is not the right time. It lacked all sorts of diplomacy, and I would say differentiation. Jung had a lot of feeling, and you know, when he says that the Aryan unconscious can be explosive, well, that's himself. I mean, Jung could be a very explosive person. Whereas I feel that Neumann's response, that's why I use the word assertive realism. Neumann was quite an aggressive person. He was a warrior. And in fact, when I did this show in Israel as Neumann, I said to the daughter, Rachel, I said, look, maybe I acted in a way that was dishonoring your father, perhaps too aggressive. And she answered, oh, not at all. He was much more aggressive than you were, which kind of shocked me. But, you know, every movement needs the warrior. It's a very valuable energy, the fighter who hits you on the level of the shadow. And the good thing was that I think Jung could take it. That's why this relationship lasted, whereas a lot of his colleagues could not take that aggression. They just could not. They felt he was too aggressive, too assertive, too domineering. Yeah. So I think that's one of the welcoming side of Neumann, that he could really face up to you.
Yeah, he could, and he could discuss with Jung on his own grounds and hold his own. They said the stories from Eranos, which we'll hear about later too, is that, you know, after the lectures, Jung would go on the balcony, and his students would gather around him, and he would give a review of the lecture, often very critical review of the lecture. Did he like it? Didn't he like it? And he would hold forth. And they said it was very different after Neumann arrived on the scene, because Neumann stood beside him and met his arguments and forced Jung to think further, or to correct himself, or to explain himself. Nobody else dared to do that. So this Neumann was really a very unusual and a very strong personality, I think, because he had a very strong mind. he could just stand up to another mind and hold it, hold his ground. He wasn't intimidated by Jung. And so on this question of the potential of the, yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I just want to say, I just hope that the people who surround Trump will stand up to him, because then there's some hope that it won't be so bad as one imagines.
I wasn't.
People need someone to stand up to them.
Yes, I wasn't intending to make a comparison of Jung and Trump, but maybe.
No, I'm not saying that at all. Not at all. I'm just saying the principle of any leader figure need the people not to just be courtiers, but to
exactly. And this is what you remember in the White letters. We found the same thing. You played Victor White in those letters, and White also was very upset by the courtiers around Jung, all the who never asked him a challenging question or put other points of view in front of him. They just sort of followed along. And so this seemed to be, a number of people observed this in those years, that the circle around Jung was a little too idealizing and admiring and yay-saying, and yeah. So on this point of the potential of the unconscious, Neumann corrects Jung and says, that's wrong. The Jews have as much potential in the unconscious as the Germanic people do. And I think today, the field would come around to Neumann's position. I mean, would we say about any group of people or any individuals that their unconscious doesn't have very much potential? I mean, we don't think that way, really, do we?
Absolutely not. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Israel, it's quite different. There you see a lot of connection to the unconscious, to the sonic, to the warrior, to everything that these are not people who are more feminine in their nature. So the thing about it, I feel, is that when you make statements about a people, you must say it might be at this time, which actually Jung did, but that doesn't define their essence, doesn't define their identity, because that identity is changing, as Neumann says in that letter, throughout the course of history. It's the circumstances that count.
Yeah.
That's what forms the culture of a people.
Well, I think Neumann was a friendly critic to Jung, but a very bold one, and at times a very aggressive one. But I think it was a very good thing for Jung to hear that. A lot of critics of Jung since that time have said that Jung overgeneralizes, that he says way too often everybody or all these people are, he talks about the Americans as though, that's one personality, but there are many different types and many different kinds of Americans and so on. But when he goes to America and he starts commenting about American psychology, it's very overgeneralized. It's kind of funny, actually, in retrospect, what he says. But in our field, this direction that Jung took of group psychology or national psychologies has received some further impetus, I think, from Andrus Samuel's work later, who picked it up and, of course, does a very different thing with it, but says it pays to reflect on national character and national personality, but one has to do it very carefully, and always with the caveat that this is what we perceive, or this is how we're thinking about it. To reify it or make it into a truth about a people, I think is a very, very tricky business. And Jung certainly got burned badly by his generalizations about the Jewish people, who he didn't really know or understand very well from personal experience until I think later he did catch on to it through his experience with his students and some further studies.
I was going to jump on and say a couple of things. First of all, we have a number of questions coming in, so please keep sending those questions in. I want to acknowledge a person or two in the audience, a real Shalitz. I know you're signed on at least. If you want to participate at all, I don't know if you're in good shape to do so or not, but please click the raise your hand button, and we would be delighted to open up your microphone. If you're not feeling up to it, that's of course completely okay as well. We would love any comments from you, Ariel. Imelda Galdazart is online too, I noticed. She wrote a biography on Emma Jung. And I don't know if Emma and Neumann had much connection at all, but I'd be interested at some point if Murray, John, or Imelda would like to come on with that. Imelda, click your raise your hand button if you want your microphone open. And for the rest of the audience, if you want to give a verbal question, again, please click that button. We really enjoy hearing voice to voice your questions. Let me read one of the questions that came on, and maybe that can move us in a direction. One came in and said, how did Neumann die? Who became the new crown prince, and who is the current prince? Murray or John, any thoughts on princedom and who's in charge?
Well, Neumann died of cancer of the liver, I believe, that was diagnosed only shortly before his death. He attended the Ernos conference in August of 1960, wasn't feeling too well, went to London for some tests and so on, and I don't think it was diagnosed there either. I think he went home and his health was deteriorating a little bit, but there was no indication that he was seriously ill until a few days before he died. And then I think the diagnosis was made actually after he died. Ariel would know the story in detail, I don't, but he did die of cancer, but it was of a very subtle kind that was very difficult to diagnose, and if they had been able to catch it earlier, they probably could have treated it, although at that time, 1960, I don't know what the treatment would have been. But he was a crown prince at Ernos to the extent that Olga Frebe-Capitan wanted to, on her death, in her will, she designated him as the heir of the Ernos grounds for his lifetime to use as he wanted to.
Wow.
And what she foresaw was that he would take over from Jung and take over the Ernos conferences from her and revive them and set them off in his own direction. He could do whatever he wanted to. Unfortunately, he died before she did, and so she had to change her will, and she gave it over to a foundation which still exists. Oh, there have been a lot of crown princes since then, but today I don't think there really is one. I think in our we have a very good generation. Wouldn't you agree, John? In our time, John and I trained in Zurich just about exactly the same time, from late 60s to early 70s. And I've been very pleased with all the contributions of the people in my generation. We're now in our 70s. John and I are born in the same year, 1943. And we've got lots of crown princes around all over the place. And we're looking for the new generation, Steve. We're looking for the princes coming after us.
I'd just like to say that I think that, yes, Neumann, in terms of his fame and the prolific publications, could be considered as a crown prince. And then I would say who followed him would maybe James Hillman. And if you look at Neumann and James Hillman, you're looking at opposites. So in my sort of overall view, I would say that Neumann really expressed the qualities of the spirit. He really had deep spiritual convictions. and that overflowed into his intellect. Clarity, differentiation, but coming to very strong opinions about what is psychology, what Jungian psychology is about. James Hillman dismisses spirit in many of his works and emphasizes soul. So you have here this contrast of one emphasizing spirit, the other soul. And today, I think I would agree with Murray that we have many crown princes, and it's very wise not to mention any one of them. It's rivalry that we love to have.
We don't want a civil war to begin. Oh,
yeah. Well, and you know, there's a whole other school in analytical psychology called the developmental school, and Michael Fordham was the arch enemy of Neumann. They both were Neumann's last book was called The Child. He didn't quite finish it before his death. And Neumann, Fordham dismissed Neumann's view of the child out of hand. I mean, he thought Neumann is way off base. Neumann has never worked with children. He's not a child psychiatrist the way I am. Fordham said he's never really observed infants. That was incorrect. Neumann had observed infants, and he had worked intensively with many people who were therapists for children, but he had not himself been a child therapist. But Neumann was very abstract, and Fordham, coming out of British empirical tradition, very empirical, very fact-oriented, and a terrible writer. I mean, but you could say in that generation, Neumann's rival would have been Fordham, who founded the British school, and which is very powerful. The developmental school, the Journal of Analytical Psychology, was founded there by Fordham, still is the preeminent Jungian journal, and they made a kind of bridge to modern psychoanalysis, especially beyond Winnicott, Klein, and so on. So there's a sort of interweaving of psychoanalytic and Jungian thought, and in many cases, for a long time, it was more psychoanalytic than it was Jungian. I think that has shifted over somewhat in recent times, but they've had very talented people in that London developmental school. I mentioned Andrew Samuels. There are many others who have contributed to the literature there, and now there's a kind of, I think, understanding that we all borrow from each other, and whether you're a classic Jungian like John and I are, we also are influenced by, sometimes through people like Mario Jacobi, influenced by object relations, infinite observation, attachment theory, all those things that are held in such high esteem in the developmental school, even though we work differently, twice a week, maybe once or twice a week, not on the couch, face to face, versus 4 times a week on the couch in London, and so on. So analytical psychology has become very diverse, and it was just beginning in Neumann's time. The first IAP Congress was held, I think it was 1958 in Zurich, wasn't that it, John? And there was a big fight between Fordham and Esther Harding. Esther Harding said, Fordham doesn't understand what a symbol is. He has no idea what a symbol is. Neumann was the man for symbols. Talk about somebody who takes off on symbols. Wow, Neumann is your guy. So the schools were beginning to divide there, and there were some battles royal in these early congresses, which have kind of smoothed out now, and I think there isn't such a strong splitting energy in analytical psychology anymore. It's been very diverse.
That's an interesting question. If there's a crown prince, there almost has to be a division, because people vie for the kingdom and the prince.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think of Jung being Freud's crown prince in the very beginning.
That's right. Yeah.
And then, of course, there was a violent split, and there's a new school that begins. And even with Erich Neumann, you hear that powerful, almost violent, finding who's in charge with that.
Yeah.
And maybe there is an individuation process with the school of thought itself, where there's not as many intense crown princes.
Oh, the crown princess was Mary Louise von Franz.
Oh, there you go. Right.
Yeah, she came a little later than Neumann. She was younger. And when Neumann died in 1960, she was just beginning to hit her stride. When I studied at the Jung Institute in the late 60s and early 70s, she was in her prime. And her works weren't really published until later in the 70s and 80s. But she was also very prolific and a very powerful thinker, but very different from Neumann. She's not a theory thinker the way Neumann is quite, although she can go theoretical, and she does in some of her books for sure, but not in that kind of meta-psychological way. And she's always, unlike Neumann, quoting Jung. Jung says in this passage, he says in this passage, and she established a kind of way of writing in the Jungian world where Jung is always sitting on your shoulder. Now with Neumann, he had Jung behind him, but he took off, and he could think his own thoughts, and he went in directions that Jung appreciated. And for instance, when Neumann gave his lecture Mystical Man at Eranos, in those letters that John performed, that's the lecture that C.A. Meyer walked out on, and it was very controversial. And Jung wrote a letter to one of his followers, I think it was Yolanda Jacobi, and he said, you should read Neumann's essay, but you have to think when you read Neumann. And Neumann is a demanding writer. You can't just read him like you would a cheap novel. Can't read Jung that way either. Jung is a demanding writer, but Jung is more poetic. Neumann is more philosophical and metaphysical.
Wow.
Yes, the old rivalry. I can remember attending Franz's lecture, and she would say Neumann was too intellectual. She would always get this dig at Neumann. Why sibling rivalry?
That's right, yeah.
Right.
At the conference in Tel Aviv, Ann Lammers gave a very interesting paper on sibling rivalry between Neumann and James Kirsch. James Kirsch was a friend of Neumann's, also an acquaintance. I don't know about friendship, but Neumann knew him, and Kirsch moved to Palestine before Neumann did. He moved immediately after Hitler came into power. He left. He knew what was coming, and he left, and he went to Palestine, and he set up his practice there. And when Neumann came, now there were two Jungian analysts trained by Jung in town, and Ann Lammers gave a paper about James Kirsch's sibling rivalry with Neumann. That they were both writing nasty letters to Jung about the other one, and their deficits and faults and so on. Jung had to manage a lot of this kind of stuff going on among his disciples and followers.
Yeah, I can remember one thing that Neumann said about James Kirsch when he was in Israel. He distinguishes himself by constantly changing his mind. That's a typical sort of undercut by Neumann.
Also interesting that Neumann wrote the Jacob Nisau writings that Karen published about a year ago. Actually, it's right here, Jacob Nisau.
Yes.
And talks about the brother motif, and is then interesting that Neumann himself was caught in that with the other first generation Jungians. Maybe a reason why that sibling archetype is so powerful and written about by Neumann.
That's a book that Neumann wrote in the 30s. That was one of his early works, unpublished, and now it's come out. Thanks, Steve, for bringing it out. Edited by Ariel, with a nice introduction by Ariel, actually, and it's a very interesting work. It's on biblical psychology and what the Bible can teach us about psychology.
Very powerful. Let me get to some more questions. There's a flood coming in now of questions, and one hand raised, actually a couple hand raised. Let me go with the hands, and then I'll start trying to sort through the written questions. Jamie, eGolf, I'm going to try to open up your microphone. And there, wait, well, let me do Jamie first, but Ariel's raised his hand. Let me do Ariel. Let me open up Ariel. It's so delightful to have you there. Ariel, I just clicked the unmute button. Yeah, are you able to speak with us?
Steve, hi, Murray.
Nancy, hi.
Hi, Nancy.
This is Nancy Ferlotti, and I'm sitting here with Errol, and we're both participating. He doesn't have much of a voice right now, unfortunately. So, but I just wanted to step in and say hello and give his greetings too, and make a comment.
Yes.
I was so struck by the article that Jung wrote, Psychotherapy Today. If you look closely at the course of his writing in there and his discussion about Freud, it's about that time when he really starts focusing on Freud that I think he falls into a terrible father complex. And that is what unleashes a lot of the things that he says about the Jews. And I think he had some pretty serious problems with Freud in terms of the father-son relationship. And in contrast to that, I don't think that ever really got kicked off by Neumann because of the age difference. He didn't have the father complex with Neumann, even though Neumann was as challenging and as intellectual as Freud was with Jung. But I think he felt put down to a certain extent by Freud, and you can see the kind of the emotion building at a certain point in that article where he takes off, and of course he's somebody who will speak his mind. He doesn't hold back at all. And out it all comes, all this kind of complex emotional material. And I'm not so sure people have looked at that closely enough to recognize exactly what was going on there. I think it was a lot of his unconscious just kind of flowing out in anger and in a very raw way. So I just wanted to throw that out and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think that has been noted, that when he's talking about Jewish psychology, he's really talking about Freud. And in fact, Jung did not know very many Jews. Freud was his first real experience of meeting and spending time with and getting to know somebody of a deep Jewish background and history. And so his impression of the Jew was formed by Freud and Freud's attitude. So when he talks about Jewish psychology, he's talking about Freudian psychoanalysis, which is very personal, very focused on the family, on incest, on brother, sister, mother, father, mother, child, mother, son, father, daughter, that sort of family drama. And I think that's what Jung thinks of when he says Jewish psychology. He's thinking about the way Freud was developing and writing psychology. But I think Freud was in Jung's mind a lot. And in his last work, I studied this recently in a seminar with some students. The last thing that Jung wrote was the essay on dreams in Man and His Symbols. This was supposed to be a popular book for the public, and And the first essay in the book is by Jung, and then von Franz writes, Henderson, a number of other people. And Jung is writing on dreams. Last thing he writes, it's on dreams, and Freud is mentioned countless times in that work. This is at the end of Jung's life. Jung is still arguing with Freud. Now, the first book of Freud's that Jung ever read was probably Freud's greatest book, Interpretation of Dreams. And so Freud, in a sense, haunts Jung for the rest of his life. They had an official break in 1912-13, didn't speak to each other again, but Freud was never far from his thinking. And that essay in 1934, when Jung was president of the International Medical Psychotherapy Society and so on, is, I think you're right, Nancy. I think it's a response to Freud, and what Jung sees as Jewish psychology is really his take on Freudian psychology. And he's been criticized a lot for being opportunistic in using that moment in German history of Germany, terrible thought even, to promote his psychology at the expense of Freudian psychology, because Freud's books were burned in 1933 and in the famous book burning ceremonies around Germany. And Jung's books were, psychology was being promoted by some members of the Nazi Party, Goering and others. And that Jung would not see how he was being used, although I think he did later see that. He caught on to it. And there's a book just recently published, also by Chiron, called Jung's Evolving Views of Nazi Germany, from the Nazi takeover to the end of World War II, by this couple, William Schenel and Linda Schenel. Now, Schenel's been studying this subject for many years. He's a historian. And he sees Jung changing his mind as time goes on. But 1934 is very early in this period. And Jung hasn't really caught on to what's really happening in Germany and how he's being used by these German psychologists and doctors to legitimize what their country is doing. Jung's thought was he's helping psychotherapy survive under terrible conditions. Their thought was we can use Jung. He's an international figure, and he'll give our country legitimacy because he's Swiss and so on. And so I think Jung was terribly naive, and plus what you say about Freud, that was there, and out came this very poorly considered, dreadful piece that will haunt Jung's reputation to the end of days, I think.
Yes, and maybe I could say, I agree. I think it's very interesting, your observation of that article, because it starts with a general description of, psychology, it's against technique, the individual is what counts, and then it goes into this tirade about Jewish and Aryans unconscious, and it ends up then with an attack on Freud. And it seems to me it's disconnected, and I think that's the way complexes work. It's not running through, it's disconnected. And especially at the end, when he's talking about Freud's The Future of an Illusion, he really attacks him for not understanding the Germanic unconscious, so that's already siding with the Germanic people at that time. And secondly, he attacks Freud, and that's maybe more understandable, that he then dismisses the universality of motives, in other words, the archetypes, the gods and the demons. But it's an interesting article, but I would just say, as you do, it's complex also, in both meanings of the word.
I might shift over to some other questions. Nancy and Rel, I'm going to mute your microphone, but just raise your hand again if you want it opened up. Be happy to do so anytime. And Jamie, I promised to open yours, Jamie Eagle, if I'm reading that right. It's in small script. So Jamie, your microphone should be open in a moment. Do you have a question?
Hi, Marie. Hi, Jim. And hi, Steve. Thank you for taking my comment. It's really a comment more than anything. I was just talking relating to the comment about Trump, and it's that I don't see him as occupying the position he might want to, the king, or even an older male patriarchal figure. I more see him as the evil trickster. He has created so much chaos here and certainly all over the world. So that's my comment.
Yes, we
Yeah,
could go
I mean,
on.
that's another discussion. I've found ever since last summer, it's impossible to have a conversation about anything with anybody without ending up talking about Trump. He has invaded the collective mind to such a degree that everything is sort of referred to him for some reason. And I think Trump likes that. I think he wants everybody in the world talking about him. It's like the narcissist said, I've been talking about myself long enough. Why don't you talk about me for a while now? I think Trump really likes that.
Yes, we could talk. We are going to do a seminar in that too distant future to follow up. We did a few seminars on Trump earlier. We've got one brewing. Stay tuned for that. But we'll give a long opportunity to have people talk more about what they feel is going on, with the shadow and the various elements in U.S. politics.
Well,
Go ahead, John.
interesting to think, what would Neumann say about what's happening in the collective today? A lot of people have said, well, it's not so different from the 1930s. I mean, there are big differences, of course, too, our time and that time, but there are lots of similarities, and that's what worries me the most, that it isn't just Trump, but all the support that he's gotten. Where does that come from? And how did Hitler get into power? He was voted in. It was democratic. It was a democratic process. He didn't take over without the majority of the Germans voting for him. And he stayed in power, and his popularity increased with time, like Putin's. Putin's running 80% in the polls in Russia. Hitler had the same thing in Germany. People loved him. That's what's so troubling. And so what would Neumann say about our times? Would he compare his times? He lived through the 20s in Germany, the 30s, early 30s.
Well, Trump has a hypnotic quality, and I think people are now coming out of their hypnosis and starting to, in the polls, they're starting to say, no, I don't believe this. I don't believe what you're saying.
Good.
Yeah.
Waking up.
I think so. I mean, really, people had no clue what the ideology was that he was promoting, if there even was one.
I think Neumann has something to say about this. In his book, Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, where he talks about a recollectivization of society. So, these three stages: participation, the importance of group psychology, then the individual, but now an ethic based on the individual is faced with this recollectivization of society. And therefore, the individual has a responsibility to speak up about the masses, about these dangers. And of course, that comes from his experiences in Germany. He saw what happened.
Yeah. And so Neumann is a developmental thinker, stages of consciousness. And these stages don't unfold without crisis and backing and forwarding. And so this recollectivization, I mean, you could say that in recent times with Obama and so on, that the movement toward the individual went too far, too fast, and is now backing up, and there's a recollectivization process going on, a resistance to that movement, and that has to be worked through, and in order to move on to further development of individual consciousness. But right now, I think that's very good, John. I think that Neumann put his finger on it, recollectivization, people going back into a kind of mob psychology.
Mob psychology, exactly.
Yeah.
Because
It's very hard
recollectivization.
to resist. When you're in the mob, it's very hard to stand up in your own consciousness and resist it, because a part of you wants to contribute, wants to join in. Nobody's exempt from these powerful unconscious forces that draw us all into mob psychology.
Mm.
What's the next progression past that phase, Murray or John, that Neumann refers to, or is there a stepwise progression from that phase, or not so much?
Well, I think it's a continuation of the movement toward the individual, but if the recollectivization process is strong, it takes a long time for that individual to emerge again.
We need a Neumann who can stand up against the crowd, right? Because that was the third stage of the development of the ethical attitude, was to speak out and stand up against this recollectivization.
And that's what he was challenging Jung to do. We expect a great man to stand up. Remember in that first letter he said that, yeah.
Huh. Wow. Let me get to some of the other questions. Jen's window left, if I'm able to read that correctly. I'm going to unmute your microphone in a moment. Then David Johnston, I've got your question I'm going to read. And David, if you want to open your microphone and speak the question, that's even better. Go ahead and raise your hand. Otherwise, after Jen's, I'll go ahead and read off the question you sent in earlier.
Okay, you hear me?
Yes, we can indeed.
Okay, I'm a Danish Jungian graphologist, very interested in the characters of Jung and Neumann, and I have with great interest read Martin Leach's biography of Neumann, and what struck me was that Neumann's relationship to the Jungian circles was a real individuation drama. The opposition to Meyer being the conventionalist, and Jacobi as the extroverted person. In fact, I met her in her very old days. But I have wondered, why was Neumann's Tief Psychologie und Neue Ethik, why was it so controversial? To me, it seems that he had provoked the central, very half fundamentalistic Europe. At this time it was Jews, and now we see that the same way of being European fundamentalistic is against the Muslims, also the refugees and so on. So I think this is one of the reasons why Neumann real is actual now. Have you some points on this? This is a real political one.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good observation that what the Jews were in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, because they were flooding in from Eastern Europe into the West after the First World War, and there was an immigration crisis, a migration crisis then like there is now, only it was Jews, not Muslims. And so they became the outsiders, and there had been a lot of Jews living in Europe previous to that time, in Germany especially, very successful. And so this attack on the Jews was a combination of envy for the success of the Jews, their intellectual success, their professional success. Many of them were quite wealthy, bankers, newspaper owners, and so on, collectors of art. I mean, amazingly successful people. There was envy of that on the one hand. On the other hand, there were these shtetl people coming in, very different kinds of Jews who were not at all assimilated, would never be assimilated, practiced their own strange religion. Yeah. And so it's very similar to what we see today. Now, Neumann wrote this article on depth psychology and new ethic out of that crisis. So he's trying to find a way for a person in the individual stage of consciousness development, individuation, in the individual stage, to be aware of ethical responsibility, because what tends to happen is that when you leave the patriarchal stage with its rituals and its rites and its codes and its laws, you feel freed from all that. You feel, now I can be a free person. I can live my impulses. I can live my id, my desires. Why do I have to control myself? Now I'm freed from all that. I can be myself. Finally, I can be anything I feel like. And that's dangerous because it brackets the whole ethics question. So as you leave that second stage of ethical development that he calls the old law, and you enter into this individual stage, you're threatened with loss of impulse control, loss of standards, ethical awareness, values, because you rejected the conventions. You rejected that whole patriarchal system. Now what have you got? So what he's struggling with is how to formulate an ethical sense when you're an individual and you aren't looking to external codes, you aren't looking to the Bible, you aren't looking to outside authorities. What do you have? Well, he developed this idea of the ego-self axis. And that's when that I that John was talking about comes into his forehead. And to develop the ego-self axis is, for Neumann, an ethical project. That with the ego-self axis, you are in connection with values and ethics and the traditions and all of that, but you are bound by it, and you have some leverage, but it's an internal voice. He calls it the voice sometimes, the voice that will persuade you as an inner conscience, sort of a conscience or inner sense of direction and values to do the right thing. But you can't be certain of it because you can't check it against the law, the codes. You can check it, but you can say, well, I departed. And he says in that letter that John read, I have done evil knowingly because I had to, but I've done it consciously. And so it isn't that you're a good boy again, but you're a conscious person who, when you act, take on the responsibility for your actions and pay the consequences for your actions and say, I have to do it this way. This is what the self, if I'm going to be in contact with the self, I have to do it like this. This is very different from getting caught up in mob psychology, where the mob tells you, now let's go down this street and burn some houses down here, or let's attack that guy over there. He looks like one of them. That's mob psychology. The individual acts with full responsibility, even though in a sense you know that what you're doing goes against certain codes and rules, and sometimes you have to carry the burden of guilt.
I
It's a
totally
very
agree.
difficult road, and it wasn't understood by those Jungians who got that book. I think they thought, oh, he's trying to reinstitute the law again. He's trying to go back into the old, ethics codes and ethics system. They just didn't read the book carefully. It isn't what he's trying to do.
I
Trying to take it
totally
a step
agree.
further.
I totally agree. I totally agree, but
Because maybe I can just say a few. I think that, when I was studying in 1968 at the Young Institute, there was a continual mistrust of intellectuals. And you can see in the letters that this, especially Yolanda Jacobi, was a projection onto Neumann. Because he wasn't just an intellectual. He was, but not only. He had a very differentiated mind. He was a very sensitive person and a deeply spiritual person. But as soon as you collectivize some person or some group, you diminish them. You diminish their value. And I think that was behind it. It was a projection of their own maybe inferior function, their own uneasiness or fear of the mind, the intellectual mind. And of course, now we see today, but it's in a different category, as Murray mentioned. It's no longer, as you mentioned, it's no longer Jews, because I think Erich Neumann was very sensitive about this Jewish issue. And it certainly was in the collective, a fear, a resentment of Jews, or a collectivization of them, a devaluing of them. Today we have the Muslims, same situation. And so I think we have to be very careful of, I think Neumann would really say this, it's not just the collective, it's individuals and their relationship to the self. That's the beginning of authentic dialogue.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, each of you with that. That's a marvelous discussion and point. I'm going to, David, read your question off, David Johnston. I'm going to send an invite for the microphone, but just ignore it if you don't want to open your microphone. And then there's another hand or two. Actually, your hand went up. So David, can you hear us? Is the microphone open?
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
Yeah, but barely. It's really quiet. I don't know if you have a gain on your microphone or if you can speak closer or louder to it. I can read your question or you can ask it directly, either way.
Yeah, maybe it'd be better if you read it, if you can't hear me very well.
I can hear you right now. I can hear you perfect now. So go ahead.
Yeah, so like, I just like to say, like Murray, many years ago when I started my Jungian studies, I came across Neumann's Origins and History of Consciousness and then the Great Mother, and I was really taken by these two books. And I've followed Neumann ever since, and as a matter of fact, what I've been trying to do over the years is discern the difference between Neumann and Jung, because that to me is highly important. Maybe because I'm a Virgo, but discernment is and differentiation between the two is highly important. And when I look at, Neumann's vision is very impressive, I have to say. But I would also say that it was carried by the heart Godhead, and that's phenomenal in itself, and I can understand where that could lead to his book on ethics. But he didn't. He was protected from going into the abyss at the same time. And my reading of Jung is that he did enter the alchemical abyss, and that is the key difference. Which I believe is highly significant. So I guess the question is, what do you feel about that?
Well, maybe I'll just start and say, no doubt Jung went into the abyss. I think the Red Book is a very strong example of Jung in the darkest levels of the psyche. Maybe we don't know so much about Neumann's biography, but Murray once showed me a series of his images that he painted, and this was like Neumann's Red Book, very dark, witch-like figures, which he obviously struggled with as interior figures and maybe in real people who he encountered in his life. So I think that vision of the ape man actually probably represents a series of encounters with, you could say, his shadow, the dark side, and probably with real people and even with real women. To my surprise, one of my colleagues said that Neumann had an affair with Hannah Arendt. So he was quite a boyo. I mean, I just want to give that as an example because recently in Kyoto at the Congress last year, one of my colleagues says, oh, Neumann was so dry. But when we hear these letters, suddenly you realize this was a man of vitality. This was a man of experience in life. And we could say with shadow figures, with women. So I would say in his own way, and there's no general way of telling about this, he did go into the dark levels of the psyche. He was transformed.
Yeah, I think in our next session on February 23rd, Nancy Verlotti is going to actually show those pictures, John, that Neumann painted. Neumann did, following Jung, probably Jung showed him the Red Book. I don't know. I haven't been able to confirm that Neumann ever saw the Red Book in Jung's office, but it's possible. Anyway, he started painting his dreams and active imaginations as well, and Nancy has these pictures, and she will compare Neumann's process to Jung's as it appears in the Red Book. So Jung's Red Book and Neumann's, whatever it was, Green Book, Black Book, whatever. So that'll be very interesting. But I think if Neumann had lived longer, you know, he died at 55. When you think, where was Jung at 55? Jung still had a good 30 years to write, and some of his best writing and deepest writing came in his old age. If Neumann had had another 20, 30 years, maybe some of this kind of depth of experience would have come out. I think his writing is very theoretical, quite abstract, and doesn't give a very vivid impression of his own personal experiences. You get his thoughts, but you don't get his experiences. And maybe he was just very private. Jung didn't give so much of his experiences either, and a lot of that has come out since his death, and all the biographies and letters and so on. And I think that's just maybe beginning to appear from Neumann's side now.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your comments. I tend to agree with Murray that he died at a young age, 55, and there could have been a significant difference had he lived longer. But the other point I think you're making is that his writings, are much more theoretical. And the grand design, Jung, even though he may not have talked about his experiences, everything is based on his empirical experiences. And like von Franz, who I agree should be the crown princess, at least I think is the crown princess. That was my next question, by the way, before Murray said it earlier on. I think, she says that Jung lived the universal myth, and it's a myth, and out of that came his psychology, and that's in her book, Jung, His Myth in Our Times. And to me, that's totally right on, and that is why Jung resonates so deeply with people like myself.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's clear that Jung was the master and Neumann was the student. Neumann was a brilliant student. And when you ask what are the difference between Jung and Neumann, I think somebody asked that, a journalist or somebody asked Neumann once, what is the difference between you and Jung? And Neumann said, there is no difference between us. And I think what he wanted to say was, I'm not going to break away from Jung the way Jung broke away from Freud and start my own psychology. He built on Jung. He didn't depart from Jung. When Jung broke from Freud and went into his Red Book period and Dark Night of the Soul and all that, he really forged a new psychology out of his own thinking and experience. And he was thinking theoretically at the same time he was engaging in his active imagination. He wrote the first drafts of the 2 essays. He wrote Psychological Types. These are highly theoretical thinking books, and they're grounded in his experience, and he was forging a new psychology. Neumann wasn't about that. He didn't want to do that. Hillman was closer to that. Hillman had that kind of rebellious spirit. Hillman's initial article on declaring his independence was betrayal, that he was stabbed in the back and betrayed by his Jungian elders. And so he went his own way and founded a new psychology, archetypal psychology, which borrows from Jung, but takes often significant directions of its own, very different from Jung's ideas or Jungian work and Jungian language and vocabulary. Neumann didn't do that. Neumann wasn't that kind of a rebel. He was a builder of theoretical constructs. And
Yeah,
I think Neumann also didn't write cases. In a letter, he says his wife Julie wrote a letter to Olga Frebe just after Neumann's death, and she says in there that they had many discussions, and Neumann said to her, "Why do I have to write these kinds of essays, these kinds of high-flying, far-reaching theoretical essays? Why can't I do like everybody else and write cases? Cases. Why don't I write case material, write up cases?" He never did, because I think that isn't where his passion was. He lived very intensely. He lived a short life. He wrote all of this stuff in basically 15 years. So a very intense period of thinking and thinking through issues that Jung had left dangling and unconnected. And so his job was to build a structure using the pieces that Jung had given him, and not go in a wholly different direction.
Yes, and maybe I could just add, to get a sense of Neumann's soul journey, maybe you could read Amor and Psyche, because there he writes so sensitively, with so much feeling, outlining the stages from the marriage with death, the love of love and paradise, into finally forming what human relationship is between a man and a woman. That's the most beautiful piece of literature and must mirror something of Neumann's own personal journey. I don't think it's possible to write in the way he wrote without experiencing that kind of turmoil.
And this will be taken up, if I can just put in a plug for our series again, on April 27th, when Rina Porat and Dvora Kuczynski, two women who immersed themselves in Neumann's work. Dvora Kuczynski, actually very close to Neumann in his life as his student, will present the fourth in our series of webinars.
So I really like Amor and Psyche too. That was one of the first books I read, Neumann, and I loved it. And I've read subsequently where he's talked about the heart and the heart self, and and he talks about the feminine. And it's really, when you read that, you do have the feeling that he's definitely connected there.
Very soulful.
Yeah. So it's interesting, for me, I'm not an intellectual, but when I read Neumann, highly impressed, and it's been a difficult journey to make the discernment with Jung, but it's been important. And also, I was at the Jung Institute in Zurich when Hillman was there, and he presented the other challenge to me, and in a way, a bigger challenge. Because what he's done is cut. I remember I asked him a question in class about Jung's experiences of, his famous death experiences, conjunctio experience, and he blew up in class. And then I asked him another question, was similar another day, and he blew up again. So, but here was Hillman, inviting me to join him in his group of people that he would have discussions with, and so on, and. But what he's done is it's a new psychology of the soul in a way, but he's really cut Jung in half. He's cut out the self. And that, to me, is absolutely, there's no way he could be the crown prince with that. Anyway. That's
he went off and founded his own kingdom, for better or worse.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, David. We really appreciate your participation with this as well. We're getting close to needing to wind it down. Delighted with the conversations. Thank you all for the raised hands.
Send your questions for next time.
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize. I know there's a number of hands that are still raised. There are a number of questions that were sent in. We almost never have time to answer them all, but hopefully the ones that we get to do speak to people. Very excited for the seminar series coming up. There's 5 altogether. We just had the first one today. We have 4 others coming up. They're going to be once a month, on a Thursday, more or less, not exactly the same time each month. There's some really marvelous, pieces, from the imagery and painting to diving into the feminine, the numinosity of spirituality, and then of course the Eranos, piece. And Murray will be participating in all of them, but we'll be inviting other people into them as well. You'll get announcements as the other ones come closer, but we really hope that you're able to participate with that as well. Murray or John, any last thoughts before we kind of sign off today? Because Murray, you're muted. I think you might still be muted.
Thank you, John, for joining us as Erich Neumann. Very convincing performance again, as always.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very, very good.
Well, I mean, I'm not a very aggressive person, but having to impersonate Neumann, very helpful for the aggressive shadow. I'd recommend that to everyone.
John has a lot of expertise in psychodrama, if I remember right. So you're saying evidence of that today. Yes. Well, thank you, everybody. Yeah, John and Murray in particular, for all the people that asked questions, participated in the view. We really, thank you for your time today. Stay tuned, and we'll check back in about a month. Yeah, thank you again. Bye-bye.